The rain had turned the forest into a chorus of whispers, leaves dripping, branches groaning under the weight of water, the air thick with the smell of earth and something faintly sweet, like wet pine. I could barely hear my own footsteps over the patter, but she could. The dog, ribs showing through a coat matted with mud, had stopped dead in her tracks, her ears pricked forward. Every muscle froze except for her trembling sides, each breath shallow, sharp. And then, from somewhere deep in the thicket, came the sound that changed everything, the faint, desperate cry of a puppy. It was the kind of sound you don't just hear. It finds you in your chest, in the place that remembers what it's like to be lost and calling for someone who might never come. She bolted before I could move, paws tearing at the ground, tail stiff like a compass needle locked on true north. I stumbled after her, branches clawing at my arms, mud grabbing my shoes, my lungs burning. I didn't know it yet, but that sound in the woods wasn't just a call for help. It was the beginning of something far bigger, something that would strip away the hard shell of the world and leave only the raw, aching truth of how far a mother's love will go. The forest was alive in ways I hadn't expected. The heavy rain drummed relentlessly against the trees, a soft, steady percussion that drowned out every other sound, except for that one. At first, it was just the quiet rustle of leaves, the scent of wet moss and pine clinging to the air. I had set out to track down some lost pets after the recent floods, stray cats, dogs, any animals that had gotten swept up or abandoned. The storm had left its mark, but I hadn't expected to feel its weight so deep in my bones, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Then I saw her. She was a shadow moving between the trees, only her dark form visible through the mist. Her fur, what was left of it, was matted and slick with rainwater, sticking to her bony body. A mother, I could tell. Her movements were too deliberate, too protective. She was sniffing at the ground, darting between trees like she was searching for something, her eyes scanning the darkness like she had a purpose no one else could see. I hesitated for a moment, the impulse to approach at odds with the eerie silence that had swallowed the rest of the forest. The air felt thick, heavy, as if everything in the world had slowed to a stop. But then I heard it, a faint, trembling cry. At first it was so soft I thought my mind was playing tricks. But there it was again, this time sharper, more insistent. The sound of a puppy, the kind of cry you can't ignore. A call for help, raw and desperate, filled with the knowledge that it might be the last. The dog, hearing it too, froze for a moment. Her body tensed, eyes wide, as if every inch of her knew what that sound meant. Her ears pricked up, and then she darted toward the underbrush, breaking into a run before I could even call out to her. I wasn't sure why I followed. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the echo of that cry still ringing in my ears. Maybe it was the look in her eyes, the quiet resolve, as if she were begging for someone to understand. I slipped through the undergrowth, branches scratching at my skin, mud sucking at my boots, my breath heavy as I pushed through the rain-soaked forest. The dog was ahead of me now, her pace frantic but determined. There was a faint light up ahead, a break in the trees, where the moon had found a gap in the storm clouds. The dog stopped at the edge of a clearing, her body trembling, but she didn't hesitate. She ducked under a low-hanging branch and into the hollow of an old shed, its roof caved in from years of decay. The moment I caught up, I could hear it clearly, the sound of whimpering, soft and weak, coming from inside. I stepped forward, hesitant. The floor of the shed was covered in leaves, old wood, and tangled vines. The air smelled of rot, of forgotten things, but underneath it all, there was that smell, the sweet, earthy scent of puppies. The dog was already there, her face inches from a small, trembling bundle of fur nestled against the rotting wood. It was a puppy, barely a few days old, its eyes still closed, its tiny body limp with exhaustion. She licked it softly, then nudged it with a nose, her breathing frantic now. But there was something else. More whimpers. My heart clenched as I moved closer, crouching beside her. 3 puppies, huddled together, weak and shivering, their coats soaked through. The air was thick with the kind of desperation only a mother could understand. She nudged each of them in turn, licking their faces, whimpering softly, as if trying to reassure them, or herself. But one of them didn't move. My eyes locked on it, and I felt a cold rush of panic. It was the smallest. Curled up at the back, its tiny chest barely rising and falling. I reached forward, my hands trembling. It was only then that I realized the full weight of what I was seeing. This mother, this exhausted, starving dog, had somehow found her way to this shed through the storm, through the floodwaters, to save her babies. And now, one of them was slipping away. I couldn't help but feel the crushing weight of her struggle, the fight for survival. She wasn't just fighting for her own life anymore. She was fighting for them, for the promise of a future that didn't look so hopeless. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. The sound of rain continued to fall around us, louder now, the storm no longer just a background noise, but an angry, relentless force. I could see the way the mother's eyes flicked between her puppies, as if deciding who needed her most, who she could save. But there was no choice. There was no time. I scooped the weakest puppy into my hands, its tiny body trembling. I turned to the mother, who watched me with those wide, desperate eyes. She didn't bark or snap. She didn't protest. She just stood there, her chest heaving with each breath, watching me like she knew that I was her last chance. With one final glance at her remaining puppies, she turned and ran back into the rain. The storm howled above us, but I couldn't let it swallow this moment. I stood frozen for a heartbeat longer, holding the tiny puppy to my chest, then followed her. The rain fell harder, and in the distance, there was nothing but the howling wind and the soft, steady beat of my heart. The forest seemed to close in around us as I followed the mother dog, her figure a shadow in the downpour. Each step I took felt heavier, more urgent, as if the earth itself was trying to pull us back into its dark depths. The rain blurred my vision, making the world feel dreamlike. Yet the cries of the puppies in my arms were all too real, sharp in the silence. I glanced down at the small body I held, the puppy barely moving in my hands. Its tiny chest barely rose with each shallow breath. I could feel the warmth seeping through my shirt, the faint pulse of life still holding on, but for how long? The mother moved with a desperate energy that I couldn't quite understand. Her eyes were wild, her body slick and trembling, but she never slowed down. Her paws slapped against the soaked earth as she darted through the underbrush, her path uncertain, yet she seemed to know exactly where she was going. I pushed myself harder, my boots slipping on wet roots and rocks, the cold creeping into my bones. There was no time to waste. The floodwaters had been rising all morning, and I could hear them in the distance, a low, rumbling roar that only grew louder. The storm had turned the forest into a maze of half-sunken logs and swift, running streams. The path was becoming treacherous, and yet the dog moved forward with determination, her eyes fixed on some unseen goal. It wasn't until we reached a ridge overlooking a stream that I understood. The place was an old, abandoned farm, long since forgotten by human hands. The remains of a barn stood crooked in the middle of a clearing, half sunken into the earth. The roof sagged under the weight of rain, the walls covered in ivy and moss, a long forgotten relic of some past life. The mother darted toward it, her movements frantic. She didn't stop to check if I was behind her. I almost lost my footing on the slick ground, but I didn't care. I had to keep going. She stopped at the entrance of the barn, her nose pressed against the doorframe, her body trembling. The rain pounded harder against the roof above us, but all I could hear now was the quiet, desperate whimpering from within. Inside, the barn was dark. The only light came from the occasional flash of lightning, casting jagged shadows across the rotting wooden beams. There, huddled in the corner of the barn, was another puppy. This one looked smaller, even more fragile than the rest. The mother dog was already there, nuzzling it gently with her nose. The puppy, barely clinging to life, whined weakly in response. I stepped forward, hesitant, the sound of my own breath rang in my ears. The other puppies were still huddled together, their tiny bodies barely moving. My heart ached. I could feel the cold seep into my skin, my fingers numbing as I gently placed the weak puppy beside its siblings. The mother gave me a look, almost as if she was asking me if this one would be okay. But I didn't know. I did if any of them would be. I could hear the water rushing closer, feel the ground beneath my feet trembling. The storm wasn't just a storm anymore. It was an enemy, a threat that pushed us toward the edge of survival. The barn was no sanctuary. The roof was leaking, and the water was already creeping in. The floor was damp with the muck from the rising floods, and the cold settled deeper into my bones. The mother dog, now frantic, paced in tight circles around her puppies. She nudged them again and again, as if trying to tell them that everything would be okay. But she knew the truth. Her world had been torn apart, her home swept away by the flood, and now she was clinging to the last thing she had left, these tiny, fragile lives. She wasn't going to give up on them. I couldn't either. I knelt down beside them, my hand trembling as I stroked the soft fur of the closest puppy. Its breath was shallow but steady. I had to keep them warm. I had to keep them alive. But the flood was coming. The barn, once a place of shelter, was becoming a trap. The water would reach it soon. I could already hear the rushing noise of the stream, now turned into a river, pounding against the trees in the distance. We had no time left. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. There was no choice now but to move them. All of them. I scooped up the smallest puppy first, its body cold and limp, and held it close to my chest. The mother watched me with those wide, pleading eyes, her body tense with worry. She followed me as I stepped back, moving as quickly as I could, her body low to the ground, her eyes never leaving her pups. We had to get out of there. The water was coming, and we had no more time to waste. I glanced over my shoulder as I reached for the others, my heart racing. The mother dog was already ahead of me, her paws splashing through the mud as she raced toward the ridge where the stream met the flooded field. She was leading us out, leading us to safety. But even now, in the darkest moment of the storm, I knew the journey was far from over. I took a final look at the barn, now half submerged in water. The storm was relentless. The world was breaking apart. But in that moment I understood we were fighting for survival, all of us, together. The sky had shifted into a bruise-colored canvas, the clouds thickening as the storm pressed on. My boots splashed through the rising water, my legs heavy with exhaustion, but I kept moving. The small puppy in my arms was so cold, its tiny body barely noticeable against the rain-soaked fabric of my jacket. I could feel its heartbeat, faint, like a whisper. The other two puppies clung to my chest beneath my coat, their fragile bodies shivering uncontrollably. But they were alive, and that was all that mattered. Behind me, the mother dog led the way, her pace steady despite the conditions. She never looked back, never hesitated. She was a force of nature, a mother who would carry her babies through the fire itself if she had to. I could feel the determination radiating off her, her instincts guiding us, pulling us towards something we couldn't yet see. But the road ahead was becoming more and more treacherous. The water had turned the path into a thick, soupy mire, sucking at my feet with each step. The forest had transformed into an obstacle course half, submerged branches and debris, some large enough to block the way entirely. We were moving slower now, each step a battle against the weight of the world, trying to drown us. The storm was relentless, the water rising quickly. At one point, the ground beneath my feet gave way, and I stumbled. My heart raced as I felt myself slipping, my hands reaching for anything solid. The mother dog stopped in her tracks, her ears flicking back toward me, her eyes wide and focused. She didn't wait for me to regain my balance. She was already moving again, her paws splashing through the flooded ground, tail stiff and resolute. I finally found my footing again, my arms sore from holding the puppies against my chest. I pressed on, my breath ragged, the cold sinking into my bones. But the hardest part was still ahead of us. We reached the stream just as the storm's fury reached its peak. The water churned, a dark, angry current rushing through the jagged rocks below. The bridge, a thin, slippery log that had once served as a crossing, was barely visible beneath the swelling torrent. It was our only way across. I froze at the edge, the sound of rushing water filling my ears, drowning out everything else. The log bridge wavered under the weight of the flood, the sides slick with rain. I glanced at the mother dog, who was already standing at the far side of the bridge, waiting for us. She didn't hesitate, just watched me with that calm, unwavering gaze, as if to say, "You can do this." I took a deep breath, my heart in my throat. With one final glance at the roaring river below, I stepped onto the log, my arms tight around the puppies, my every muscle clenched with fear. The log creaked under my weight, but I focused on my next step, one at a time. The world had become a blur of sound and motion. The rush of water, the slap of my boots against the slick surface, the desperate cries of the puppies as I moved forward, every breath a prayer. The mother was already on the other side, watching, waiting. She was safe, but I wasn't. The log wobbled beneath me as I reached the halfway point, and for a moment I felt the terrifying pull of the current beneath. I could feel the water tugging at my legs, my balance faltering. My hands gripped the puppies tighter, my pulse pounding in my chest. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't fall. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed forward. My heart raced, my body trembling. But I took the final step. I made it. I collapsed onto the far bank, my breath rag, every muscle in my body screaming with exhaustion. The rain beat down harder now, but at least I was on solid ground. I felt the mother dog press against me, nudging my shoulder as if to say, "It's okay, you made it." We had made it. But as I looked at the small family huddled in my arms, I knew we weren't out of danger yet. The storm was still raging, and the path ahead was uncertain. We needed to get to higher ground, away from the rising floodwaters. The mother dog had led us this far, but now it was time for us to find a way out. I stood shakily, the water rushing at my feet, and started to move again, the puppy's soft whimpers the only sound in the air. The storm was pushing us forward, testing us, but we would fight. All of us. Together. The road ahead was long and filled with danger, but as I walked, I knew one thing: we would not stop. Not until we were safe. Not until the last puppy was in a warm bed, dry and fed. Not until the mother could rest. Not until we had found what we had been fighting for. Because the storm was only one battle. The real fight was for their future, and I wasn't going to lose. The storm had not let up, its fury only growing more relentless as the minutes stretched into hours. The wind howled through the trees, the rain falling in sheets that blurred the world into a watercolor of gray and black. We moved as one. The mother dog leading the way, her pace steady and unwavering, me struggling to keep up, my body aching with exhaustion, my arms growing numb beneath the weight of the puppies. But the worst was behind us. We had crossed the stream, and now the path seemed to open up, offering a faint hint of light through the trees ahead. For the first time in hours, I saw the faintest glimmer of hope. The ground beneath us was softer now, no longer a dangerous swamp, but a more solid terrain. The water had receded somewhat, the floodwaters finally stabilizing, though the rain continued to beat down relentlessly. The trees seemed to thin out as we pushed through the underbrush, and in the distance, I could make out the outline of a cabin, a small shelter that had once been a remote hunting lodge. It was barely visible through the downpour, but it was there. We were almost there. I glanced at the puppies, still huddled against my chest. Their shivers had grown quieter, more manageable. I could see a slight warmth returning to their bodies, the soft rhythm of their breaths less labored. The smallest one, the one who had been the weakest, was still hanging on, but its little body remained limp. The mother dog kept her eyes trained ahead, but her steps had slowed just a little. I could see it in her movements, a wariness creeping in, even as she fought to keep moving. She had led us this far, through the storm, through the forest, across the dangerous river. But now, she too was feeling the weight of the journey. I reached out to gently rub her back, just a soft, reassuring touch. She glanced back at me, her eyes soft but still full of that unyielding resolve. She wasn't going to stop now. Not we were so close. As we neared the cabin, I felt the coldness of the night seep deeper into my skin. My body trembled, a mix of exhaustion and the chill of the rain that had soaked through every layer of clothing. The cabin was just ahead, a small, weathered structure that had stood through countless storms, its wooden frame creaking under the weight of the rain. I didn't know if it would be warm inside, or if there would be any shelter left, but it was our last hope. We made our way to the door, and as I knocked weakly against the frame, I almost felt like I was knocking on the door of salvation. It creaked open, and a pair of warm, welcoming eyes appeared at the threshold. The shelter volunteer, who had been helping search for the animals, was there, her face lined with worry, but now softening as she took in the sight of us. She wasted no time. "Get them inside," she said gently, reaching for the puppies in my arms. The warmth that greeted us was a stark contrast to the bitter cold we had just left behind. The cabin's interior was modest, a fire crackling softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. There was an earthy smell to the place, the scent of dry wood and the faint musk of animals that had taken refuge from the storm. The volunteer led me to a corner where a few blankets were spread out, and I gently placed the puppies down one by one. They whimpered as they settled into the warmth, their little bodies still cold, but now comforted by the heat of the room. The mother dog curled up beside them, her eyes never leaving them for a moment. I stood back for a moment, taking in the sight, the soft, steady breaths of the puppies, the mother's unwavering watchfulness, the warmth filling the room. It felt almost surreal, as if the storm outside were a distant memory, and we had crossed some invisible line into safety. But then, the smallest puppy stirred just a little. A weak, desperate whimper escaped its lips, and for a moment, it seemed like the world had stopped. The mother's ears pricked up, her head snapping toward the puppy. She nudged it gently with her nose, her body tense, her eyes full of hope and concern. I moved closer, my heart hammering in my chest, my hands trembling as I reached out to gently touch the puppy. Its breath was shallow, but it was breathing. It wasn't too late. The volunteer leaned in, her hands shaking as she gently adjusted the blanket around the puppy. We both watched, holding our breath, waiting. And then, the smallest miracle. The puppy took a deep breath, and for the first time in hours, it opened its eyes. The room filled with a collective sigh of relief. The storm might still be raging outside, but inside the cabin, in the warmth of the firelight, a small family was safe. The mother dog, her tail wagging weakly, finally laid down beside her puppies, her eyes closing for the first time in hours. She was exhausted, but she didn't have to worry anymore. We had made it. As the fire crackled in the hearth, I watched the small family huddled together, and a soft smile tugged at the corners of my mouth. They had fought for each other. And in the end, they had found a place to rest. We had found something more than shelter. We had found hope. The rain had finally begun to fade by morning, as if the earth itself had exhaled a long, exhausted breath. The storm that had raged so fiercely throughout the night had tapered off to a quiet drizzle, leaving behind the scent of fresh earth and wet leaves. The sky was still heavy with clouds, but they had softened now, their edges losing the sharpness of the night. The world outside the cabin had been washed clean, every tree and rock glistening under the pale light breaking through the overcast sky. Inside, the fire still smoldered gently in the hearth, its warmth filling the room, but the true warmth, the kind that lingers in your chest and settles your soul, was here, in the quiet, peaceful moment between the mother dog and her puppies. The smallest puppy, the one that had barely clung to life through the storm, was now nestled securely in its mother's embrace. Its breathing was steady, its tiny body no longer limp but soft and warm, its eyes blinking slowly as if adjusting to the world. The mother, her eyes soft with exhaustion and relief, rested her head beside her pups, her body curled around them protectively. I watched the scene unfold before me, a quiet testament to the power of resilience and the deep, unspoken bond between a mother and her children. It was as though the storm had been a distant memory, fading into the background as life continued to move forward, one tiny breath at a time. The volunteer, who had been watching from the other side of the room, approached me slowly. She smiled softly, but her eyes were full of unspoken emotion. We didn't need words. We had witnessed something incredible, something that defied the odds. "They're going to make it," she whispered. I nodded, my throat tight. I couldn't find the words, not yet. There was too much to process, too much to feel. But there, in that moment, I knew one thing for certain. These puppies, this family would be okay. I had seen the worst of nature, the violence of the storm and the floodwaters, but I had also seen the best of it. The way the mother had fought for her children, the way they had all clung to life despite the odds. It had been a battle, a long, painful fight, but it was one they had won, together. As the morning light began to filter through the windows, I stepped outside to gather my thoughts. The air was crisp now, the rain easing to a drizzle that left everything feeling new, as if the world had been washed clean. I stood at the edge of the cabin, the quiet stillness of the forest around me, and breathed in deeply, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. It was a moment of clarity, a moment of peace. I could hear the faintest sounds of birds in the trees, the distant murmur of water still flowing, but nothing felt as heavy anymore. The storm had passed. The struggle was over, and what had been broken was now healing. When I returned inside, I found the mother dog, still curled up with her puppies, her tail wagging ever so slightly as she looked up at me. It was the first time I saw her eyes fully relax, the tension of the previous night giving way to something that resembled peace. She had done it. She had led her family through the storm. She had protected them when there was no one else, and now she could rest. I crouched down beside her, gently stroking her back. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. She simply leaned into my touch, her eyes half closing as she allowed herself a moment of respite. I watched the puppies, their small forms curled together in a little pile, soft and warm. Their breathing was steady now, the shaky, desperate gasps from the night before replaced with the soft rise and fall of life. They were going to make it. The volunteer knelt beside me, her hands gently adjusting the blankets around the puppies. "They're going to be okay," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet hope. I nodded, still lost in the moment. There was nothing else to say. As the hours passed, the rain eventually stopped completely. The forest began to dry, the birds returning, the sky brightening with the promise of sunlight. It felt as though the world was slowly waking up, emerging from the shadow of the storm. And for the first time since I had found the small family, I felt the weight of the night lift from my chest. The danger had passed. The journey was over. The storm that had raged so violently had been nothing more than a fleeting moment in the grand scheme of things. And now, as the sun finally broke through the clouds, I saw something even more beautiful than the clearing sky. The mother dog, resting peacefully, the soft sound of her breathing mingling with the quiet rustle of the wind outside. It was a moment of closure, of healing. The world had been torn apart and rebuilt in the span of a single night, and now there was only the sound of gentle breaths and the soft warmth of survival. The puppies were safe. The mother could finally rest. And we, the volunteers, the helpers, the strangers who had crossed paths, we had done something meaningful. We had given them a chance at life, at love, and at the future they so rightly deserved. As I stood up and turned to leave, I took one last look at the small family in the corner of the cabin. The mother dog was still with her puppies, but her eyes met mine one last time, filled with gratitude, filled with quiet strength. I left the cabin, the sun now breaking through the trees, casting golden light across the wet ground. The storm was gone, but the memory of it, the struggle, the fight, the love, would remain. And as I walked away, I couldn't help but think that sometimes the hardest battles lead to the most beautiful moments. And in the end, that's what matters. As I stepped away from the cabin, the sky above me was opening up, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds like a promise, soft, golden, and full of hope. The storm had passed. The world was still bruised, but in its recovery, it whispered something deeper. Every struggle, every storm has its end. And from that end, something beautiful can emerge. Behind me, I could hear the soft shuffle of the mother dog as she gently nudged her puppies. Her head lifted for a moment, her eyes catching the sunlight, her body at rest but her spirit unbroken. She had survived. She had fought not just for herself, but for them, her children. And now they were safe. I paused for a moment, just standing there, letting the warmth of the sun touch my face, feeling the weight of the journey we had all shared. There were no words, no final gestures, just the knowledge that in this small, quiet corner of the world we had made a difference. We had given them a chance. As I turned and walked away, the sound of gentle breathing filled my ears, the promise of new beginnings wrapped in the peaceful silence that followed the storm. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I knew that sometimes the hardest battles lead to the most beautiful endings. And that, for all of us, was enough.